The Plague by Albert Camus. We left off at the top of page 31 and continue today. The word plague had just been uttered for the first time. At this stage of the narrative, with Dr. Bernard Rieu standing at his window, the narrator may perhaps be allowed to justify the doctor's uncertainty and surprise, since, with very slight differences, his reaction was the same as that of the great majority of our townsfolk. Everybody knows that pestilences have a way of recurring in the world, yet somehow we find it hard to believe in ones that crash down on our heads from a blue sky. There have been as many plagues as wars in history, yet always plagues and wars take people equally by surprise. In fact, like our fellow citizens, Rio was caught off his guard, and we should understand his hesitations in light of this fact, and similarly understand how he was torn between conflicting fears and confidence. When a war breaks out, people say, "It's too stupid, it can't last long." But though a war may well be too stupid, that doesn't prevent its lasting. Stupidity has a knack of getting its way, as we should see if we were not always so much wrapped up in it ourselves. In this respect, our townsfolk were like everybody else, wrapped up in themselves. In other words, they were humanists. They disbelieved in pestilences. A pestilence isn't a thing made to a man's measure. Therefore, we tell ourselves that pestilence is a mere bogey of the mind, a bad dream that will pass away. But it doesn't always pass away, and, from one bad dream to another, it is men who pass away, and the humanists first of all, because they haven't taken their precautions. Our townsfolks were not more to blame than others. They forgot to be modest, that was all, and thought that everything was still possible for them, which presupposed that pestilences were impossible. They went on doing business, arranged for journeys, and formed views. How they should have given a thought to anything like plague, which rules out any future, cancels journeys, silences the exchange of views. They fancy themselves free, and no one will ever be free so long as there are pestilences. Indeed, even after Dr. Rieu had admitted in his friend's company that a handful of persons, scattered about the town, had without warning died of the plague, the danger still remained fantastically unreal. For the simple reason that, when a man is a doctor, he comes to have his own ideas of physical suffering, and acquires somewhat more imagination than the average. Looking from his window at the town, outwardly quite unchanged, the doctor felt a little more than a faint qualm for the future, a vague unease. He tried to recall what he had read about the disease. Figures floated across his memory, and he recalled that some 30 or so great plagues known to history had accounted for nearly 100 million deaths. But what are 100 million deaths? When one has served in a war, one hardly knows what a dead man is after a while. And since a dead man has no substance unless one has actually seen him dead, 100 million corpses broadcast through history are no more than a puff of smoke in the imagination. The doctor remembered the plague at Constantinople, that according to Procopius caused 10,000 deaths in a single day. 10,000 dead made about 5 times the audience in a bigger cinema. Yes, that's how it should be done. You should collect the people at the exits of 5 picture houses. You should lead them to a city square and make them die in heaps if you wanted to get a clear notion of what it means. Then at least you could add some familiar faces to the anonymous mass. But naturally that was impossible to put into practice. Moreover, what man knows 10,000 faces? In any case, the figures of those old historians like Procopius weren't to be relied on. That was common knowledge. 70 years ago at Canton, 40,000 rats died of the plague before the disease spread to the inhabitants. But again, in the Canton epidemic, there was no reliable way of counting up the rats. A very rough estimate was all that could be made, with obviously a wide margin for error. Let's see, the doctor murmured to himself. Supposing the length of a rat to be 10 inches, 40,000 rats placed end to end would make a line of... He pulled himself up sharply. He was letting his imagination play pranks, the last thing he wanted just now. A few cases, he told himself, don't make an epidemic. They merely call for serious precautions. He must fix his mind, first of all, on the observed facts. Stupor and extreme prostration, buboes, intense thirst, delirium, dark blotches on the body, internal dilation, and in conclusion, some words back to the doctor's mind, aptly enough, the concluding sentence of the description of the symptoms given in his medical handbook. Quote, the pulse becomes fluttering, dichrotic, and intermittent, and death ensues as the result of the slightest movement. Yes, in conclusion, the patient's life hung on a thread, and 3 people out of 4, he remembered the exact figures, were too impatient not to make the very slight movement that snapped the thread. The doctor was still looking out the window. Beyond it lay the tranquil radiance of a cool spring day. Inside the room, a word was echoing still, the word plague. A word that had conjured up in the doctor's mind not only what science chose to put into it, but a whole series of fantastic possibilities utterly out of keeping with that gray and yellow town under his eyes, from which were rising the sounds of mild activity characteristic of the hour, a drone rather than a bustling, the noises of a happy town, in short, if that's possible to be at once so dull and happy. A tranquility so casual and thoughtless seemed almost effortlessly to give the lie to those old pictures of the plague. Athens, a charnel house reeking to heaven and deserted even by the birds. Chinese towns cluttered up with victims silent in their agony. The convicts at Marseille piling rotting corpses into pits. The building of the Great Wall in Provence to fend off the furious plague wind. The damp, putrefying pallets stuck to the mud floor at the Constantinople Lazar House, where the patients were hauled up from their beds with hooks. The carnival of masked doctors at the Black Death, men and women copulating in the cemeteries of Milan, cartloads of dead bodies rumbling through London's ghoul-haunted darkness, nights and days filled always everywhere with the eternal cry of human pain. No, all those horrors were not near enough as yet even to ruffle the equanimity of that spring afternoon. The clang of an unseen streetcar came through the window, briskly refuting cruelty and pain. Only the sea, murmurous behind the dingy checkerboard of houses, told of the unrest, the precariousness of all things in the world. And gazing in the direction of the bay, Dr. Viau called to mind the plague fires of which Lucretius tells, which the Athenians kindled on the seashore. The dead were brought there after nightfall, but there was not room enough, and the living fought one another with torches for a space where to lay those who had been dear to them, for they had rather engaged in bloody conflicts than abandoned their dead to the waves. A picture rose before him of the red glow of the pyres mirrored on a wine-dark, slumberous sea, battling torches, whirling sparks across the darkness, and thick, fetid smoke rising toward the watchful sky. Yes, it was not beyond the bounds of possibility. But these extravagant forebodings dwindled in the light of reason. True, the word plague had been uttered. True, at this very moment 1 or 2 victims were being seized and laid low by the disease. Still, that could stop or be stopped. It was only a matter of lucidly recognizing what had to be recognized, of dispelling extraneous shadows and doing what needed to be done. Then the plague would come to an end, because it was unthinkable, or rather because one thought of it on misleading lines. If, as was most likely, it died out, all would be well. If not, one would know it anyhow for what it was, and what steps should be taken for coping with and finally overcoming it. The doctor opened the window, and at once the noises of the town grew louder. The brief, intermittent sibilance of a machine saw came from a nearby workshop. Rio pulled himself together. There lay certitude, there in the daily round. All the rest hung on mere threads and trivial contingencies. You couldn't waste your time on it. The thing was to do your job as it should be done. The doctor's musings had reached this point when the visit of Joseph Grand was announced. Grand's duties as clerk of the municipal office were varied, and he was sometimes employed in the statistical department on compiling the figures of births, marriages, and deaths. Thus it had fallen to him to add up the number of deaths during the last few days, and being of an obliging disposition, he had volunteered to bring a copy of the latest figures to the doctor. Grand, who was waving a sheet of paper, was accompanied by his neighbor, Cottard. "The figures are going up, doctor. 11 deaths in 48 hours. Rio shook hands with Cottard and asked him how he was feeling. Grand put in a word explaining that Cottard was bent on thanking the doctor and apologizing for the trouble he had given, but Rio was gazing frowningly at the figures on the sheet of paper. "Well," he said, "perhaps we better make up our minds to call this disease by its name. So far we've only been shilly-shallying. Look here, I'm off to the laboratory. Like to come with me?" Quite so, Grand said as he went down the stairs at the doctor's heels. "I, too, believe in calling things by their name. What's the name in this case?" That I shan't say, and anyhow you wouldn't gain anything by knowing. You see, Grand smiled, it's not so easy after all. They started off toward the Place d'Armes. Courtard still kept silent. The streets were beginning to fill up. The brief dusk of our town was already giving place to night, and the first stars glimmered above the still clearly marked horizon. A few moments later all the street lamps went on, dimming the sky, and the voices in the street seemed to rise a tone. "Excuse me," Grand said at the corner of the Place d'Armes, "but I must catch my car now. My evenings are sacred. As we say in my part of the world, never put off tomorrow." Rio had already noticed Grand's trick of professing to quote some turn of speech from, quote, his part of the world. He hailed from Montélimar, and followed up with some such hackneyed expression as, quote, lost in dreams or pretty as a picture. "That's so," Cottard put in. "You can never budge him from his den after dinner." Rio asked Grand if he was doing extra work for the municipality. Grand said no, he was working on his own account. "Really?" Rio said, to keep the conversation going. "And are you getting on well with it?" "Considering I've been at it for years, it would be surprising if I wasn't, though in one sense there hasn't been much progress." May one know," the doctor halted, "what it is that you're engaged on?" Grand put a hand up to his hat and tugged it down upon his big, protruding ears, then murmured some half-inaudible remark from which Rieux seemed to gather that Grand's work was connected with the growth of a personality. Then he turned rather hastily, and a moment later was hurrying, with short, quick steps, under the fig trees lining the Boulevard de la Marne. When they were at the laboratory gate, Cottard gave the doctor that he would greatly like to see him and ask his advice about something. Rieux, who was fingering in his pocket the sheet of paper with the figures on it, said he'd better call during his consulting hours, then, changing his mind, told him he would be in his part of the town the next day and would drop in to see him at the end of the afternoon. On leaving Cottard, the doctor noticed that he was thinking of Grand, trying to picture him in the midst of an outbreak of plague. Not an outbreak like the present one, which would probably not prove serious, but like one of the great visitations of the past. "He's the kind of man who always escapes in such cases." Ria remembered having read somewhere that the plague spared weak constitutions and chose its victims chiefly among the robust. Still, thinking of Grand, he decided that he was something of a mystery man in a small way. True, at first sight, Grand manifested both the outward signs and typical nature of a humble employee in the local administration. Tall and thin, he seemed lost in the garments that he always chose a size too large, under the illusion that they would wear longer. Though he still had most of the teeth in his lower jaw, all the upper ones were gone, with the result that when he smiled, raising his upper lip, the lower scarcely moved. His mouth looked like a small black hole let into his face. Also, he had the walk of a shy young priest, sidling along walls and slipping mouse-like into doorways, and he exuded a faint odor of smoke in basement rooms. In short, he had all the attributes of insignificance. Indeed, it cost an effort to picture him otherwise than bent over a desk, studiously revising the tariffs of the town baths, or gathering for a junior secretary the materials of a report on the new garbage collection tax. Even before you knew what his employment was, you had a feeling that he had been brought into the world for the sole purpose of performing the discreet but needful duties of temporary assistant municipal clerk on a salary of 62 francs 30 centimes a day. This was, in fact, the entry that he made each month in the staff register at the municipal office, in the column "Post in which employed." When 22 years previously, after obtaining a matriculation certificate beyond which, for lack of money, he was unable to progress, he was given this temporary post, he had been led to expect, or so he said, speedy confirmation in it. It was only a matter of proving his ability to cope with the delicate problems raised by the administration of our city. Once confirmed, they assured him, he couldn't fail to be promoted to a grade that would enable him to live quite comfortably. Ambition certainly was not the spur that activated Joseph Grand. That he would never swear to, wryly smiling. All he desired was the prospect of a life suitably insured on the material side by honest work, enabling him to devote his leisure to his hobbies. If he accepted the post offered him, it was from honorable motives, and if you might say so, loyalty to an ideal. But this temporary state of things had gone on and on. The cost of living rose by leaps and bounds, and Grand's pay, in spite of some statutory rises, was still a mere pittance. He had confided this to Rieux, and no one else seemed aware of his position. And here lies Grand's originality, or anyhow an indication of it. He could certainly have brought to official notice, if not his rights, of which he wasn't sure, at least the promises given him. But for one thing, the departmental head who had made him had been dead for some time, and furthermore, Grand no longer remembered the exact terms. And lastly, this was the real trouble. Joseph Grand couldn't find his words. This peculiarity, as Ria had noticed, was really the key to the personality of our worthy fellow citizen. And this it was which always prevented him from writing the mildly protesting letter he had in mind, or taking the steps the situation called for. According to him, he felt a particular aversion from talking about his rights. The word was one that gave him pause, and likewise from mentioning a promise, which would have implied that he was claiming his due and thus bespoken an audacity incompatible with the humble post he filled. On the other hand, he refused to use expressions such as your kindness, gratitude, or even solicit, which to his thinking were incompatible with his personal dignity. Thus, owing to his inability to find the right words, he had gone on performing his obscure, ill-paid duties until a somewhat advanced age. Also, this anyhow was what he told Dr. Rieu. He had come, after long experience, to realize that he could always count on living within his means. All he had to do was to scale down his needs to his income. Thus he confirmed the wisdom of an opinion often voiced by our mayor, a business magnate of the town, when he insisted vehemently that in the last analysis, he emphasized this choice expression, which indeed clinched his argument, there was no reason to believe that anyone had ever died of hunger in the town. In any case, the austere, not to say ascetic life of Joseph Grand was in the last analysis a guarantee against any anxiety in this respect. He went on looking for his words. In a certain sense, it might well be said that this was an exemplary life. He was one of those rare people, rare in our town as elsewhere, who had the courage of their good feelings. What little he told of his personal life vouched for acts of kindness and a capacity for affection that no one in our times dares own to. Without a blush, he confessed that, dearly loving his nephews and sister, his only surviving near relation, whom he went to France to visit every other year. He admitted that the thought of his parents, whom he lost when he was very young, often gave him a pang. He did not conceal the fact that he had a special affection for the church bell in his part of the town, which started pealing very melodiously at about 5 every afternoon. Yet to express such emotions, simple as they were, the least word cost him a terrible effort, and in this difficulty in finding the words had come to be the bane of his life. "Oh, doctor," he would exclaim, "how I'd like to learn to express myself." He brought the subject up each time he met Rieu. That evening, as he watched Grand's receding form, it flashed on the doctor what it was that Grand was trying to convey. He evidently was writing a book or something of the sort, and quaintly enough, as he made his way to the laboratory, this thought reassured him. He realized how absurd it was, but he simply couldn't believe that a pestilence on the great scale could befall a town where people like Grand were to be found, obscure functionaries cultivating harmless eccentricities. To be precise, he couldn't picture such eccentricities existing in a plague-stricken community, and he concluded that the chances were all against the plague's making any headway among our fellow citizens. And with that, we conclude tonight's reading.